Walk into any Starbucks today and you'll see people hunched over laptops, checking their phones, maybe having a quiet business meeting over lattes. Pretty normal, right? But what if I told you that 300 years ago, coffee houses were the internet, the stock exchange, and the evening news all rolled into one? Welcome to 1688 London, where a single penny could buy you a cup of bitter coffee and access to the most powerful information network in the world. Picture this. It's barely dawn in London, and while most of the city is still rubbing sleep from their eyes, coffeehouse keepers are already grinding beans and stoking fires. The smell of roasting coffee drifts through narrow streets, mixing with the usual London aroma of horse manure and coal smoke. By the time the sun clears the rooftops, these modest establishments are buzzing with more energy than a modern newsroom during a breaking story. Now, before we dive deeper into this caffeinated world of 17th century intrigue, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What surprised you most about how information travelled before the internet? Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll have plenty to choose from. The coffee house wasn't just a place to grab your morning fix. It was where merchants learned which ships had arrived safely and which had been swallowed by storms. It was where writers tested their latest verses on a live audience. It was where fortunes were made and lost based on whispered rumours that might or might not be true. These weren't your quiet, contemplative coffee shops. They were loud, smoky, and absolutely essential to how London worked. Let me paint you a picture of what walking into one of these places would have been like. The moment you push through that heavy wooden door, you'd be hit by a wall of noise. Conversations in 3 different languages, the scratch of quill pens on paper, the clink of ceramic dishes, and underneath it all, the constant bubbling of coffee pots. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the bitter smell of coffee that was probably strong enough to wake the dead. You'd pay your penny at the bar. And yes, that's where the phrase penny university came from, because for that small price, you could sit and listen to some of the smartest conversations in London. The keeper would hand you a dish of coffee, not a cup like we'd expect, but a shallow bowl that you'd sip from while trying not to burn your tongue on liquid that was probably hot enough to strip paint. But here's where it gets interesting. You couldn't just sit anywhere you wanted. The coffee house had its own social rules that were stricter than most clubs today. Strangers were seated together on purpose. The whole point was to mix people up, to get conversations flowing between merchants and writers, sailors and scholars. It was like forced networking, except instead of awkward small talk about the weather, you'd hear first-hand accounts of pirates in the Caribbean or the latest gossip from the royal court. The morning crowd was something to behold. Merchants would spread their shipping lists across wooden tables, their fingers tracing routes from London to exotic ports you'd never heard of. Students sat nearby, frantically copying down prices and rumours into little notebooks. These weren't just casual observers. They were gathering intelligence that could make or break their futures. Imagine trying to predict the stock market by eavesdropping on conversations, and you'll get the idea. Then you had the pamphleteers. These were the bloggers of their day, reading aloud from fresh broadsides. Think of them as the 1688 version of breaking news alerts. They'd stand up and announce the latest political scandal or military victory, and the entire coffee house would fall silent to listen. No television, no radio, no phones buzzing with notifications. Just one person with a piece of paper containing news that might change everything. The really smart operators were the ones who knew how to read between the lines. A captain mentioning casual difficulty with customs might mean new taxes were coming. A merchant complaining about delayed shipments could signal a coming shortage that would drive prices up. Every conversation was potential profit or disaster, depending on how you interpreted it. But the real magic happened at midday when the post arrived. This wasn't email dropping into your inbox. This was physical letters carried by riders from the exchange and the coast, sometimes bearing news that was already days old by the time it reached London. The coffee house keeper would sort through the mail and suddenly the entire room would shift into high gear. Letters would be passed from table to table, read aloud, debated, and dissected. A rumour of a shipwreck would send merchants scrambling to calculate how it might affect their investments. News of a successful voyage would cause others to recalculate their own shipping plans. It was like watching a primitive computer network processing information, except the processors were human brains fueled by caffeine and tobacco. The keeper wasn't just serving coffee, he was running the whole operation like a conductor leading an orchestra. He'd keep order with house rules that were posted on the walls and strictly enforced. No swearing, no shouting, no drawing swords in heated arguments. Yes, that last one was apparently necessary to mention. These were passionate times, and passionate men with access to sharp objects needed clear boundaries. When tensions started rising between customers, a good keeper could cool things down with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a strategic repositioning of the seating arrangement. They were part bartender, part mediator, part information broker. The best ones knew exactly which customers had the most reliable information and which ones were just blowing smoke. By late afternoon, the character of the coffee house would shift again. Printers would arrive with bundles of fresh gazettes, the newspapers of the day, still warm from the press. These publications were more like newsletters, filled with shipping news, political updates, and carefully worded opinions that could get their authors arrested if they went too far. Information brokers would work the room, trading bits of intelligence for credit or favors. These weren't official positions. They were entrepreneurs who made their living by knowing things other people needed to know. Think of them as human search engines, except you had to buy them drinks to get them to work properly. Even poets and writers used coffee houses as testing grounds for their work. They'd try out new verses on the crowd, gauging reactions to see if their latest creation would find an audience. It was like an open mic night, except the stakes were higher because your reputation as a writer could be made or destroyed by how well your words landed, with a room full of caffeinated critics. As evening approached and candles were lit to push back the gathering darkness, the pace would finally begin to slow. The day's conversations would wind down. Cups would be collected and washed, and the keeper would stack up the notes and papers that customers had left behind. These scraps of information were valuable in their own right. Tomorrow's conversations would build on today's discussions. The transformation of these simple rooms into the nerve centres of London's information network didn't happen overnight. It grew organically as people discovered that coffee and conversation created something powerful when combined. A penny's worth of coffee brought you access to a world of knowledge that would have been impossible to gather any other way. But the real genius of the coffeehouse system wasn't just in gathering information. It was in how quickly that information could spread. A single piece of news could travel from table to table faster than wildfire through dry grass. 1 minute, a sea captain would mention spotting French warships near Dover. 5 minutes later, that same information would be flying out the door with a dozen different merchants, each adding their own interpretation and urgency to the story. The speed of this information network would put modern social media to shame. No algorithms deciding what you should see, no character limits cutting off important details, just pure, unfiltered human communication powered by caffeine and the desperate need to stay ahead of the competition. A merchant who heard about a ship's arrival 30 minutes before his rivals could corner the market on whatever cargo that ship was carrying. What made this system truly remarkable was how it handled verification. Unlike today, where anyone can post anything online, coffeehouse information went through a natural filtering process. Regular customers knew which sources were reliable and which ones were just spinning tales to get attention. A sailor known for stretching the truth would find his stories met with skeptical glances and careful questioning. Meanwhile, a merchant with a reputation for accuracy would have people hanging on his every word. The keepers themselves became master curators of information. They'd remember who said what, when they said it, and how accurate their previous predictions had turned out. Some kept informal ledgers tracking the reliability of their regular customers' information. It was like having a human fact-checking system built right into the social fabric of the place. Different coffeehouses developed their own specialties and reputations. Lloyd's Coffee House became the go-to spot for shipping news and marine insurance. Yes, the same Lloyd's that's still insuring ships today. Jonathan's Coffee House attracted stockbrokers and became the unofficial predecessor to the London Stock Exchange. Garraway's was where you went for commodity trading. Each establishment carved out its own niche in London's information ecosystem. The competition between coffeehouses was fierce. Keepers would try to attract the most knowledgeable customers by offering better service, more comfortable seating, or access to the latest publications. Some even hired professional newsreaders, men who would stand up and deliver the day's most important information in a clear, engaging voice. Think of them as the first news anchors, except they worked for coffee instead of television networks. The social mixing that happened in these spaces was revolutionary for its time. In most of London society, rigid class barriers kept different types of people from mingling. But in the coffee house, a duke might find himself sharing a table with a ship's carpenter, both of them equally interested in news about grain prices or foreign wars. The only currency that mattered was information, not your family name or the size of your estate. This democratic mixing of classes terrified the authorities. King Charles II actually tried to shut down all coffeehouses in 1675, claiming they were breeding grounds for sedition and unrest. The public outcry was so intense that he had to reverse the decision within 11 days. People simply couldn't function without their information networks. It was like trying to shut down the internet today. Technically possible, but practically disastrous. Women were largely excluded from coffeehouse culture, which meant they developed their own information networks through tea parties and social visits. But their exclusion also meant that coffeehouses became intensely male spaces where business could be conducted without the social constraints that governed mixed-gender interactions. This created a unique environment where ideas could be debated more freely than in most other social settings. The physical layout of coffeehouses was carefully designed to encourage conversation. Long communal tables forced strangers to sit together. High-backed wooden benches, called boxes, provided some privacy for sensitive business discussions, while still keeping conversations audible to nearby tables. The keeper's bar was positioned to overlook the entire room, allowing him to monitor conversations and intervene when necessary. Lighting was crucial to the operation. During the day, large windows let in natural light for reading newspapers and writing letters. As evening approached, candles would be lit and strategically placed to illuminate the most important areas. The flickering candlelight created an intimate atmosphere that encouraged confidential conversations while still providing enough illumination for business to continue after dark. The coffeehouse menu was surprisingly limited by modern standards. Coffee was the main attraction, but it was often served alongside ale, wine, and sometimes chocolate for those who could afford the luxury. Food was typically simple: bread, butter, maybe some cold meat or cheese. The focus wasn't on culinary excellence, but on creating an environment where information could flow freely. Tobacco played a huge role in coffeehouse culture. Clay pipes were as common as coffee cups, and the ritual of packing, lighting, and smoking tobacco gave men something to do with their hands while they talked. The shared experience of smoking also created bonds between strangers and provided natural breaks in conversation that allowed new topics to emerge. The air in these places must have been thick enough to cut with a knife. The economic impact of coffeehouses on London's development cannot be overstated. They provided the infrastructure for financial markets, insurance systems, and international trade networks that would dominate British commerce for centuries. Deals worth thousands of pounds were struck over penny cups of coffee. Partnerships were formed, investments were made, and entire industries were born in these smoky, crowded rooms. But perhaps the most important function of coffee houses was their role in creating what we'd now call public opinion. Before mass media, there was no easy way for ideas to spread throughout society. Coffee houses provided the mechanism for political ideas, scientific discoveries, and cultural movements to gain momentum and influence. They were the laboratories where public opinion was formed, tested, and refined before spreading out into the wider world. The intellectual ferment brewing in these establishments was intoxicating in ways that had nothing to do with alcohol. Scientists would test their theories on rooms full of merchants and scholars, getting immediate feedback that could shape their research. Writers would gauge public reaction to political ideas before committing them to print. It was like having focus groups for every major decision, except the participants were volunteers who paid for the privilege of offering their opinions. Take the case of scientific discoveries. When Isaac Newton's ideas about gravity and motion were making their way through London's intellectual circles, coffee houses became the testing grounds where these complex theories were explained, debated, and either accepted or torn apart by practical men who understood how things worked in the real world. A ship captain might point out flaws in a mathematical theory based on his experience with tides and wind patterns. A clockmaker could offer insights into mechanical principles that academic theorists had overlooked. The speed at which ideas evolved in these spaces was remarkable. A single conversation could spark a chain reaction that would transform an entire field of knowledge. Someone would mention a problem they were having with their business. Another person would suggest a solution based on something they'd heard in a different coffee house. And by the end of the day, a new technique or method would be spreading across London's commercial network. But the real genius of the system lay in how it handled contradictory information. When two different sources provided conflicting reports about the same event, the coffee house became a courtroom where evidence was weighed and verdicts were reached through collective discussion. A merchant claiming his ship had been attacked by French privateers might find his story challenged by another captain who had sailed the same waters on the same day and seen nothing unusual. These debates weren't just academic exercises. Lives and fortunes hung in the balance. A false report about plague in a foreign port could shut down trade routes for months. An inaccurate rumour about crop failures could cause food prices to spike across the city. The men in these coffee houses knew that information was literally a matter of life and death, which made them incredibly careful about separating fact from fiction. The psychology of information sharing in coffee houses was fascinating. People hoarded their most valuable secrets while freely sharing less important details. A merchant might openly discuss general shipping conditions while carefully concealing specific details about his own cargo. It was like playing poker with information instead of cards, everyone trying to gain advantage while giving away as little as possible. Yet despite this natural tendency towards secrecy, the social pressure to contribute something valuable to the conversation forced even the most cautious individuals to share useful information. Nobody wanted to be seen as a freeloader who took without giving. The unwritten rule was that if you wanted access to other people's knowledge, you had to contribute your own insights to the collective pool. The seasonal rhythms of coffeehouse life reflected the broader patterns of London's economy. Winter months brought news from the Americas as ships completed their Atlantic crossings before the worst weather set in. Spring arrivals carried intelligence from Mediterranean ports and the Ottoman Empire. Summer brought reports from the Baltic trade routes and news from the northern fishing grounds. Each season had its own information specialties and corresponding conversations. Political news required especially careful handling. The wrong opinion expressed too loudly could result in charges of sedition or treason. Coffeehouse keepers developed subtle ways of managing political discussions, redirecting dangerous conversations towards safer topics, or simply raising the noise level in other parts of the room to mask sensitive discussions. They walked a constant tightrope between allowing free expression and protecting their customers from government persecution. The relationship between coffee houses and the printing industry was symbiotic and essential. Printers needed to know what topics would sell before they invested in producing pamphlets or books. Coffeehouse conversations provided market research that helped them make these decisions. Meanwhile, the printed materials they produced gave coffeehouse discussions new topics and information to digest. It was a feedback loop that accelerated the spread of knowledge throughout society. Foreign visitors to London were often amazed by the openness of coffeehouse discussions. In most European countries, such free exchange of information and opinion was either forbidden or carefully controlled by authorities. English coffeehouses represented a new kind of social space where ideas could compete based on their merit rather than their source. A good argument from a common sailor could carry more weight than weak reasoning from a nobleman. The apprenticeship system that dominated most London trades extended into coffeehouse culture. Young men would accompany their masters to these establishments, learning not just their trades, but also how to navigate the complex social and economic networks that surrounded their businesses. They absorbed lessons about reading people, evaluating information, and building the relationships that would sustain their careers long after their formal training ended. Women found ways to participate in this information economy despite their exclusion from the coffeehouses themselves. They operated their own networks through market stalls, domestic visits, and church gatherings. Some became intermediaries, carrying information between the male-dominated coffeehouse world and the female social networks that controlled different types of knowledge. A few enterprising women even established their own versions of coffeehouses, though these were generally smaller and less influential than their male counterparts. The impact of weather on coffeehouse operations was more significant than you might expect. Rainy days packed the rooms with people seeking shelter, creating intense information exchanges as everyone shared news and gossip while waiting for the weather to clear. Sunny days might see smaller crowds, but more focused business discussions as serious merchants used the quieter atmosphere for important negotiations. The architecture of these buildings evolved to support their function as information centers. Proprietors added more windows to improve lighting for reading. They installed better ventilation systems to handle the smoke from dozens of pipes. Some even created specialized seating areas for different types of customers. Quiet corners for writers, central tables for general discussion, and private booths for sensitive business meetings. The economic model of coffeehouses was surprisingly sophisticated. Beyond the basic penny admission fee, many establishments operated credit systems that allowed regular customers to run tabs for coffee, food, and services. Some offered mail collection and forwarding services. Others provided writing materials, translation services, or access to specialized publications. The most successful coffeehouses became one-stop service centers for London's business community. Competition between establishments drove innovation in customer service. Some coffeehouses hired professional readers who would summarize the day's news for customers who couldn't read. Others employed scribes who could write letters for illiterate sailors or translate documents for foreign merchants. A few even offered primitive banking services, holding money and valuables for traveling customers. The closing rituals of coffeehouses each evening were almost ceremonial in their importance. As candles burned low and conversations wound down, the keeper would make final rounds, collecting the last scraps of information that might prove valuable tomorrow. Regular customers would exchange final pleasantries and confirm meeting times for the next day. The physical act of sweeping up the day's debris of newspapers, pamphlets, and handwritten notes represented the end of one information cycle and preparation for the next. These establishments created their own calendar of important dates and events. Everyone knew which days brought the fastest ships from Amsterdam, when the quarterly trade reports would arrive, or which evenings featured the most interesting speakers. Regular customers planned their schedules around these information peaks, ensuring they were present when the most valuable intelligence was likely to surface. The coffeehouse system reached its peak efficiency during times of crisis or uncertainty. When war threatened, when plague appeared in distant ports, or when political upheaval loomed. These establishments became command centers where the city's commercial and intellectual leaders gathered to assess threats and coordinate responses. The network that had been built around casual conversation and daily business suddenly revealed itself as London's early warning system and crisis management infrastructure. What made this entire system work was trust, not the naive trust of innocence, but the calculated trust of people who understood the value of reliable information and the cost of deception. Reputations built over years of accurate reporting could be destroyed by a single major falsehood. The social pressure to maintain credibility was enormous, creating a self-regulating system that was remarkably effective at separating truth from fiction. The legacy of these 17th century information networks would extend far beyond their time. The habits of critical thinking, the skills of information evaluation, and the social structures that supported free exchange of ideas would become fundamental characteristics of English society. The coffee house had created something new in the world, a space where information was democratized, where knowledge belonged to whoever could use it most effectively, and where the future was shaped by whoever understood the present most clearly. So the next time you walk into your local coffee shop and see people glued to their screens, remember that you're witnessing the latest chapter in a story that began over 3 centuries ago. Those 1688 coffee houses weren't just serving bitter coffee in ceramic bowls. They were brewing the prototype for our modern information age. From Lloyd's Insurance Market to the London Stock Exchange, from the first newspapers to the birth of public opinion, it all started with strangers sharing tables and trading stories over penny cups of coffee. The keeper who ground those beans each morning had no idea he was running the world's first social media platform. The merchants spreading their shipping lists across wooden tables couldn't have imagined their conversations would evolve into global financial networks. The poets testing their verses on caffeinated audiences never suspected they were pioneering the art of viral content. But that's exactly what they were doing, creating the blueprint for how information flows through society. Today's digital revolution feels unprecedented, but really, we're just using fiber optic cables and satellites to do what those coffee houses did with nothing but human voices and handwritten notes. Same game, different tools. The basic human need to share information, debate ideas, and stay ahead of the competition remains unchanged. We've simply scaled it up from one smoky room in London to the entire planet.